So recently, I've been studying about history's deadliest aviation accidents, so I decided to talk about the top 10 deadliest aviation crashes. Without further ado, let's begin. Number 10. China Airlines Flight 140. On April 26, 1994, Flight 140 was on approach to Nagoya International Airport in Japan, when the aircraft, an Airbus A300, stalled and crashed just short of the runway threshold. The crash killed 264 of the 271 passengers and crew on board. The crash became the second deadliest in the history of Japan, just behind Japan Airlines Flight 123. But we'll get there in a moment. Number 9. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. In the early morning hours of March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, also known as MH370, was en route to Beijing from Kuala Lumpur, when the plane, a Boeing 777-200ER, with 239 passengers and crew, disappeared from radar without a trace. Everyone on board died when the plane crashed into the Indian Ocean, but despite an extensive investigation, the airplane's black boxes were never recovered. No bodies were recovered either, and the only things to determine that this was MH370 were pieces of the 777's fuselage. And as of this video, MH370 remains the greatest mystery in aviation history. Number 8. American Airlines Flight 587. On November 12, 2001, Flight 587, an Airbus A300, departed JFK International Airport, bound for the Dominican Republic. As the plane was departing, it encountered wake turbulence due to a departing Japan Airlines Boeing 747-400, similar to this one. Anyways, there were 251 passengers and 9 crew members on board the flight. Now, due to the turbulence, the rudder was moved back and forth, from left to right. This went on for a few moments, and put enormous stresses on the stabilizer. Eventually, the stresses became too much for the vertical stabilizer to handle, and it separated from the aircraft. And without the stabilizer, the plane entered a dive, and soon crashed into a neighborhood in Queens, New York. Everyone on board was killed along with 5 people on the ground. The crash was a result of pilot error, but because the crash occurred just 2 months after the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center, Pentagon, and United Airlines Flight 93, terrorism was initially thought to have brought down the plane. Once it had come out that no terrorism was involved, and because of the enormous amount of fatalities, Flight 587 became the second deadliest crash to occur in the US, just behind the crash of American Airlines Flight 191, which we'll get into soon. Number 7. Air India Express Flight 812. Another case of pilot error resulting in the deaths of passengers. But let me explain what happened. On May 22, 2010, Air India Express Flight 812 was on approach to Mangalore International Airport in Mangaluru, India. On board the Boeing 737-800 were 166 passengers and crew. I couldn't fit this image, but something to know about the runway Flight 812 would land on is that it was built on hilly terrain and ended near a gorge, and because of where it was constructed, the runway was limited in length, meaning the pilots needed to pay attention and be careful when landing on the runway. Now back to the plane. The pilots miscalculated the landing and landed beyond the usual touchdown point, whilst also making several errors. Soon after, the plane overshot the end of the runway and fell into the ditch, where it fell apart and caught fire. Of the 166 people on board, 158 were killed, and only 8 survived this horrific crash. If the plane was slower when it overshot the runway, or if it didn't catch fire, many more could have survived the crash. Number 6. Air India Flight 855. On January 1, 1978, New Year's Day, Air India Flight 855, a Boeing 747-100, was preparing for a flight from Bombay, India, to the city of Dubai. On board the jumbo jet, there were 190 passengers and 23 crew members. The plane took off from Bombay, but there were already issues just after takeoff. There were malfunctions with the plane's equipment, but the pilots failed to properly address them, and just minutes after takeoff, the plane plunged into the Arabian Sea, and all 213 people on board were killed in India's second deadliest aviation accident. The worst plane crash was actually a mid-air collision, but I won't mention it just yet. Number 5. American Airlines Flight 191. On May 25, 1979, Flight 191, her McDonnell Douglas DC-10, was preparing for a flight from Chicago's O'Hare International Airport to Los Angeles International Airport. On board the DC-10 were 258 passengers and 13 crew members. Before I continue with the events that led up to the crash, American Airlines did some maintenance on their aircraft's engine number 1, but their methods of maintenance was not recommended by McDonnell Douglas. The maintenance procedure shown here shows a forklift lowering the engine with the pylon still attached to the engine. When whatever work was needed on the engine was done, the engine was lifted back into place, and the pylon was reattached to the wing. During the process, however, the aft bearing, shown here, suffered a crack while being reattached, and with every flight American 191 flew, the crack continued to grow. Back to the plane. Flight 191 taxied to the runway like it had done many times before, and began its takeoff roll like normal. Remember the aft bearing crack? As the plane was about to rotate, that's liftoff, the crack gave way, and engine number 1 separated from the wing. As it separated, it tore a 3-foot section in the wing, and it also destroyed electrical cables connected to the cockpit voice recorder and several of the plane's systems. The CVR captured only one thing: the pilot saying "damn." Air traffic control asked the pilots if they wanted to come back to the runway, but as you can see, the plane rolled to the left and crashed into an aircraft hangar. All 271 people on board were killed, and flying debris struck a nearby trailer park and hit several homes, destroyed several cars, and killed 2 people on the ground. This is the deadliest aviation disaster in the United States, and it could have been prevented if American Airlines followed the proper maintenance procedures by McDonnell Douglas. The next crash also involved the DC-10, but it was even deadlier than Flight 191. Number 4. Turkish Airlines Flight 981. On March 3, 1974, Flight 981 was preparing for its final leg to London. The flight had originated in Istanbul, Turkey. Aboard the DC-10 were 335 passengers and 11 crew members. The aircraft departed Paris Orly International Airport just several minutes after takeoff. At around 10,000 feet, the plane's rear cargo door blew off. This caused an explosive decompression and caused the floor above to collapse. As it collapsed, it severed critical hydraulic lines needed to control the plane. Without hydraulics, the plane crashed into a wooded area outside of Paris, and all 346 people on board were killed. At the time, it was the world's deadliest crash in aviation history, but it could have been avoided, because on June 12, 1972, American Airlines Flight 96 almost crashed outside of Detroit when its cargo door also blew off. The flight also suffered a floor collapse like Flight 981, but miraculously, one hydraulic line remained intact. Combined with the skill of the pilots, the plane was able to land safely, and all 56 passengers and 11 crew members survived. We will now get into the top 3 deadliest crashes. If you aren't in the right space to watch the rest of this video, feel free to skip the rest. These last disasters will mention enormous loss of life. Now let's continue. Number 3. The Charkhi Dadri mid-air collision. On November 12, 1996, Saudi Flight 763, a Boeing 747, was en route to Dhahran, Saudi Arabia from Delhi, India. Aboard the plane were 289 passengers and 23 crew members. Several kilometers away, Kazakhstan Airlines Flight 1907 was beginning its final approach to Indira Gandhi International Airport in Delhi. The flight, flown by this aviation IL-76, originated in Shymkent, Kazakhstan, and on board were 27 passengers and 10 crew members. Now, I won't go too much into detail, but what happened was that the air traffic controller tried to warn the IL-76 of a collision with the Saudi 747, but he was too late, and the tail of the IL-76 struck the Boeing 747 over the town of Charkhi Dadri. Both planes entered a dive and crashed just several kilometers apart. There were initially 6 survivors, from the IL-76 and from the 747, but sadly, they passed away from their injuries. In total, 349 people lost their lives in not only the world's deadliest mid-air collision, but in the deadliest plane crash in India. Number 2. Japan Airlines Flight 123. On August 12, 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123, flown by this Boeing 747-100 short-range, or SR variant, was preparing for a short flight to Osaka from Tokyo. On board were 509 passengers and 15 crew members. 7 years earlier, on June 2, 1978, this same airplane, flying under the flight number 115, sustained damage to the aft pressure bulkhead due to a tail strike. Boeing engineers worked to fix the bulkhead, but they only added 1 row of rivets instead of 2. A small crack also formed, but it went undetected, and every flight Juliet Alpha 8119, the plane's registration number, flew for the next 7 years. It slowly grew in size from hundreds, or even thousands of pressurization cycles. The plane took off from Hadana Airport, bound for Osaka, but 12 minutes after takeoff, disaster struck. The crack in the aft bulkhead caused a structural failure as well as a rapid decompression, and the tail cone and most of the vertical stabilizer ripped away from the plane. A photographer on the ground managed to capture this picture of the crippled airplane. Forgive me for this small error, but what followed after the separation were a series of up and down pitches, and an attempt from the pilots to regain control of the aircraft. But the hydraulic system was damaged by the structural failure, and the pilots had little to no control of the plane. And just 32 minutes after the bulkhead failure, the plane crashed into Mount Takamagahara. 520 people on board were killed, but miraculously, there were 4 people who survived the crash. There were initially more survivors, but because of a delayed rescue effort, they unfortunately succumbed to their injuries. Not only is this crash the deadliest involving the 747, it is also the single deadliest crash in aviation history, as well as the deadliest plane crash in Japan. And given the fact that I live in Japan, I find this disaster extremely tragic. Finally, we made it to the top deadliest crash of all time, and it is the Tenerife airport disaster. On March 27, 1977, Pan Am Flight 1736, also known as Clipper Victor, and KLM Flight for 805, to Boeing 747s, were flying from Los Angeles and Amsterdam to Gran Canaria in the Canary Islands. On board Clipper Victor were 380 passengers and 16 crew members, and on board the KLM 747 were 234 passengers and 14 crew members. At 1:15 p.m. local time, a bomb exploded in the terminal of the Gran Canaria airport. The blast injured 8 people, and the second bomb exploded soon after. Their airport was shut down, and all incoming traffic were diverted to the smaller Los Rodeos airport. Los Rodeos wasn't fit for handling the influx of traffic from Gran Canaria as it's a regional airport, so most of the airplanes had to wait on the taxiway. All traffic bound for Gran Canaria had to wait until the airport reopened. This gave the pilots of KLM flight for 805 an opportunity to refuel. By the time Gran Canaria airport reopened, the pilots of KLM for 805 were still refueling, and the pilots of Clipper Victor wanted to get to Gran Canaria. The pilots of Clipper Victor decided to move off of the taxiway also occupied by flight for 805. However, heavy fog moved in as the KLM pilots finished refueling, and this will be a factor in the fate of hundreds of lives. I was completely wrong. None of the two jets were parked on a taxiway. What this really shows is that both planes were parked at the end of the runway. Back to flight for 805. It had finished refueling and began to taxi to the other end of the runway for takeoff. Clipper Victor was then instructed to follow the KLM jet and was to exit the runway at the third exit, C3. However, the pilots were unclear if they should exit at C1 or C3, especially since visibility conditions were rapidly deteriorating due to the fog. Meanwhile, the KLM 747 had already begun its takeoff roll. The pilots of the KLM 747 realized they had to get off the runway when they spotted the Pan Am 747. The pilots pulled back on the control columns, but did so too fast, and the end of the jumbo jet struck the tarmac. When the plane managed to get off the ground, it seemed for a moment that it would clear the Pan Am 747. But unfortunately, flight for 805 collided with Clipper Victor. All 248 people on board flight for 805, along with 335 of the 396 people on board Clipper Victor, were killed. That's 583 deaths in total. And with so many deaths, it is the deadliest disaster in aviation history. This disaster was attributed to a combination of pilot error and communication error. We've now made it to the end of the video. Thank you all so much for watching. Guys, this video took forever to make. It took me a couple of hours a day since October 1st to edit and check for errors in the TTS I'm using, and all of this exhausted me, and there was a time where I wanted to give up on the project. But I kept on pushing, and I never gave up. I'll be shifting from long videos like this to small YouTube shorts for the rest of this month, as well as all of November. If you like this video, give it a like and be sure to subscribe to the channel. I'll see you all in a few days. Take care.